Hello, and thank you for joining Conversations here at CTSB. Our guest today is Meg Robertson, and Meg is the head of the New Lebanon Train Depot Restoration Project. And everyone loves old trains, and this is super interesting. So where you live over New Lebanon, you have an abandoned train depot, and you're trying to do the restoration work. And
Yes.
So let's start out with
a little bit of this.
How did you even get involved in this?
Well, this train station, many people who had lived in the town of New Lebanon were aware of it as a place to walk past on hiking trails around town. And for a long time, when I was a child even, I knew that it was there, but it didn't really mean anything to me because it was just this, big old train station building, and you see a lot of old abandoned buildings everywhere, and it doesn't, there's no history behind it, so, we didn't really pay attention to it even as kids. But recently, last December, I think it was, that my sister Kristen and I were going for a walk, and we took this delivery road that's not too far from where my house is, and walked down to go past the train station and to avoid the highway because we didn't want to walk on the highway, and just happened to notice, and we stopped and looked at the depot, and the trees had been cut down finally that had been grown up around it. And we just realized, something needs to be done. That we really have to save it because it was a really beautiful structure. It just needed somebody to start to care about it. And we knew that it had been given pretty much as a gift to the Corkscrew Rail Trail Association that had already been, as a nonprofit, created about 8 years ago to start to clear out the old railroad bed of the Corkscrew Railroad line, which had been in operation from the 1850s until 1953, actually, when that train depot was finally shut down as the Corkscrew Railroad line went out of business. They had so many financial problems, and it was just not showing to be a profitable business for them anymore, and they were up against the interstate as that was developing. But during the heyday, from the mid 1850s until 1953, it was a pretty active railroad line from Chatham, New York, all the way up to Rutland, Vermont. There were 34 towns that were impacted by this Corkscrew Railroad. And it was called Corkscrew because it was windy. It wasn't, your normal train line that is going to be relatively straight. There were a lot of curves and a lot of hills, and that became a problem because too many times in the spring there would be washouts underneath the bed of the train, and sometimes it was traveling a little too fast, perhaps, or it went around a curve. A car would fall off the tracks, and they would have to, stop. And sometimes even if it was in a relatively safe area, if this had happened, everybody got off the train, and they all helped to put that particular car back up on the train, on the railroad line itself, on the rails, before they could go on. But it was quite a very busy time, and it helped the economies of the 34 towns that it impacted. And the reason, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, why that Corkscrew Railroad line was even built was intended to be a shortcut for the train line that would then connect from New York City to Chatham and then on up to Rutland, Vermont, where it would go up to Montreal in Canada. And that worked out very well, but it was financially, as I said before, it became very difficult to keep maintaining it, because originally an individual employed by the Vermont Railroad between Rutland and Bennington that also connected to Boston, it was kind of an all tied together setup. He realized that the connection then to Montreal from New York City had to go through Utica, New York, and he didn't think that was a very economical or efficient way to move product or even people, passengers. So he convinced a couple of wealthy people who were involved already with the state to come up with about $1 million to help create this railroad line. And it had already been in existence because there were other train stations, including in New Lebanon and Lebanon Springs, that people were coming up from New York to go to the Lebanon Springs bathwaters. It was very famous. That even Lafayette was known to have traveled through New Lebanon and stopped and made use of, the bathwaters that were famous up on the hillside. But this particular train station itself, this depot, was built primarily to accommodate for and out of the generosity of Henry Tilden, who ran the Tilden Pharmaceutical Company, which was worldwide known for many, many years. And it just made common sense that his property that was right next to the pharmacy, the pharmaceutical company that he was running, he donated that land to build this train station. And it took about 6 years for them, I think it began to be constructed around 1863, and finally, by the time the very first train pulled out, from using that train station, it was December 18th, 1869. And so that was a train depot that was very heavily used until May 20th, 1953, which is, it's a short period of time if you think about the use of trains, the whole history of train use around the country. But for our area, it was a very, very busy economic boom time. Not just the Tilden pharmaceutical medicines, all the medicines that he shipped out that would go to Chatham and then down to New York City and be loaded up on freighter ships to go around the world, but also local businesses in New Lebanon made use of it by shipping out lumber. They had appliances, they had liquid natural gas, coal, a lot of coal. They had coming down the line from other towns further north, all kinds of vegetables, including, believe it or not, this is kind of an interesting vision if you get it in your head, a whole train car loaded, open obviously, not the ones with their closed up, but loaded with cabbages that they would then ship down to New York City to make sauerkraut, because people really like to eat sauerkraut for a long time, still do. But those kinds of things, it was a very useful and productive time, and people were, took full advantage of that opportunity, and it was, as I said, an economic boom for many of the towns all the way from Chatham all the way to Rutland, and it was just really unfortunate that financially they found themselves, too many repairs that needed to be done, and with the development of the interstate coming along in the 1950s, it made better sense to ship products out on trucks because they could get from point A to point B faster, not have to worry about, coming around a corner and finding a washout on the line, which, of course, that could happen on an interstate, but the likelihood would be far less disastrous than it was problematic with the Corkscrew Railroad line. So that ended up, being shut down. But this train depot was interesting in finding out a lot of the history about it, that most of the train stations on that line, the 34 that ran from Chatham to Rutland, many of them have been, they were torn down. Some of them were converted into private homes. This one in particular was just abandoned, and nobody was using it for many, many years. But they were all pretty much designed the same way, similarly to houses back in the 1800s that were frequently bought out of, parts of them were bought out of Sears Roebuck catalog. You could buy a house, you could look through the big catalogs that were, this thick, and the train stations were basically designed similarly, and to identify them as being belonging to the Corkscrew Railroad line as opposed to the Bennington line or any other line around the country. They were painted the same. They were lime green on the outside, on the clapboards, and the trim around the windows was dark green, and then the soffits right underneath the roof were like a robin egg blue color. So you knew right away, this was part of the Corkscrew Railroad line. If you went up to Petersburg, New York, you would find the similarly colored train station, and you knew that you were on the Corkscrew Railroad line. I mean, not that was, any big deal, but it's kind of interesting to know these little factoids that connected the whole railroad line to itself as being, they're all tied together. But when this was abandoned, we realized that being part of the Corkscrew Rail Trail Association, they're interested in preserving it as well, but they're more focused actually on clearing the trail to help people, give them a place to walk. So our intention is with this depot to get it restored as close to it as was before. And that would depend on the state of New York, which brings up an interesting point, that we applied back in the spring for what's called determination of eligibility. And that means in applying for National Registry status, it has to go through that panel. The committee first has to examine it, to look at all the applications that have come in from around the state for people that are asking for National Registry for a building that they have. And the state of New York had determined that this depot qualifies, which is very exciting because that means once they process all that paperwork and send it to Washington, D.C., then the National Committee will review what the state of New York is recommending, and they will say, in general, it looks good to us. If the state of New York says that it's okay, then we will award it National Registry status. But that's going to take a long time to get that official label. But in the meantime, with the determination of eligibility, we can now begin the process of applying for larger capital grants. And we have to get an engineer in there and to look it over to see what the general cost is, and an architect to look things over, just so that we know what we're looking at and how much time we might have to expect to get it restored. Do we want the original slate, which unfortunately some of the slate that has fallen off the roof is kind of brittle, so we may not be able to save all that. But we're going to try to save what we can, and if we can't put it back up on the roof, then we will save it for something else that we could use related to the train station.
Do you think it saved the train station all these years, that heavy-duty roof?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And they came from a granite roofing company. I think it was up in Hoosick Falls, New York, or Hoosick, New York, and that company is still in business. But without a doubt, we've had historic restoration workers look at that, and they've said if that slate roof was not there, then the likelihood of that building falling down or rotting faster, as any roof on any building. If you don't have a good roof, underneath it, it's the walls that might as well not have. There's not going to be any support. So that I took as a sign.
Right.
If you have good slate on the roof and it's still fairly solid. There were some big holes that we did get temporarily fixed until we can get more grant money in. Finally, a contractor got up there and he filled in the big hole that at the top of the roof that just last year the chimney collapsed. Whether it was from the weight of heavy snows or something brittle, the brittle mortar in between the bricks that made it finally collapse. But so there was a big hole in the top of the roof, and we knew if we didn't get that covered over, as historic restorers said, once the roof has a big hole like that, it's going to get bigger and bigger, and pretty soon you won't have the building. So like I said, I consider that to be a sign that, I take it from the train depot gods that were supposed to repair it and restore it. So part of what we would like to do, obviously to help the town of New Lebanon kind of get revitalized, is to, if we can get in there, to restore it and save it. There are two very large rooms, a big waiting room and a delivery room where the products were dropped off and picked up by various companies. We need a museum of some kind, because there are other towns around that I know have big historical society buildings, entire buildings, and we don't have that. And New Lebanon has so much history, from the Shakers to the Native American connections. We had the first thermometer factory. We had where bread was finally wrapped after people were tired of getting their bread delivered covered in soot from the train, the smokestacks. So all kinds of different things that have contributed to the history of New Lebanon. We need to be able to tell the story. Yeah. And by having this building here, it will help, at least I'm anticipating, to be able to impact or awaken students even in local history classes, because there's not a whole lot of local history that's taught. Right. And kids today, really, it's almost like they need to see a justification for them to be interested in the past. You know, history really is made up of our memories of things. I mean, we're creating history, and when we start to talk about things from the past, that's where the history part comes in. So telling the story about the depot, especially with kids in the town, if we have a little part of that as a museum to display pictures, to have even a showcase of showing some of the slate, to show kids how, or not just even kids, but the general public, with the holes that they had to drill in to attach the slate to the roof, to have kids understand how buildings were put up back, 100 years ago, to maybe get some student interested in history to say, that's a pretty cool thing, that, it's not just thrown on the roof with old shingles that will rot after a few years. If this was
great engineering,
incredible. Sure. And so, and an additional, I really believe that the building remained fairly intact because of the actual frame of it. That back in the 1800s, 1850s, 60s, when there were a lot of chestnut trees, the big frame of that building, as it was with the other depots, they were made out of chestnut. And a good solid wood, and then they filled in the rest with pine and whatever other wood that was available. So it was a fairly solid structure that even after being abandoned for 70 years, it was not in the condition that you would think it would be if it was not built the way it was constructed. But we're thinking, besides the museum inside, we can get something in there to have perhaps a community room, to have people gather for meetings or group, book clubs that come in there. That's right. The train station itself is right behind the library. So we could even have a little performance space there, to have a little snack shop, and even a bicycle rental place. If people walking on the Corkscrew Rail Trail stop in there and they want to rent a bike to bike up the trail, then come back, we want to be able to provide people with that opportunity so that it could be, another vibrant building to contribute to the economy of the town. I mean, it's time that we did this, and we were very fortunate. And we're very fortunate to be able to offer, with this brochure that we're delivering around and sending out to people to request for, support, either interest being volunteers to help on the project, or if they have financial support that they can provide us, anything that they can do, they can certainly contact us. But there was a famous painter in the Columbia County area. I believe he was from Red Hook, and his name was Louis Boucher. He got to be pretty famous in the Washington, D.C. area, but he painted the inside of the waiting room where people would hang out, wait to get the next train, and there was this beautiful bay window that you could see the train coming up the track, and you knew that it was time to get on it. But inside that big waiting room we can see remnants of where there was a big potbelly stove in the middle that would keep people warm. They could just sit there on the benches around the wall. So, and that room needs a lot of work. I mean, the interior of it obviously has, having been used by not just a local auto parts store, but people that have just gone in there out of curiosity, or kids going in after, to have a party in there and spray painting on the wall, unfortunately not knowing or caring what they were, vandalizing,
Right.
Spray painting pictures of hearts right over penciled in information
Yeah.
that some stock people from the train had written their supplies on the wall because they didn't have a clipboard to record the information.
That's sad for sure.
Yeah.
Take us back to 1953 when the last passenger went for a ride.
Oh yes, sure. This is there's bittersweet story behind it, but there was a gentleman by the name of Gordon Cox, and he was at the time running the Tilden Pharmaceutical Company, and because he knew that the train line was shutting down, they allowed him to be the very last passenger on that train, but he had to buy a round-trip ticket, and it cost, I think it was $1.37, which was kind of interesting. Like, what do you get for $1.37? 70 years later, not a heck of a lot. Not even the cost of
I can't even name anything.
Right, no, not even the paper for the ticket would cost $1.37. But they let him take the train ride from New Lebanon to Chatham as the last piece there, and then he had, I guess, to hitch a ride back from Chatham back to New Lebanon. But it was, sort of bittersweet that as the head of the Tilden Pharmaceutical Company, why that depot was even there, because of that pharmaceutical company, and he was at the time head of it. They did a nice thing for him, and so he posed with the engineer, and they got on the train, and he got to ride in the caboose, got off in Chatham, and that was the end of it. And unfortunately, literally the train tracks had been pulled up by that time, because as the train was pulling out of the train station, just like it had all the way down from Rutland, Vermont to all the way to Chatham, the workers were right behind it, pulling up the ties, pulling up the rails, and stacking them up, I guess. And I don't know what they ended up doing with them. I think they might have used some of the railroad ties in building to make use of them, because this good wood, but it was just kind of sad, because it was a couple $1 million project that Cornelius Vanderbilt had even been convinced to invest in, and town supervisors all up and down that line bonded. They were willing to bond money to provide financial support, and with the expectation of getting it back. But it ended up not working out all that well, despite all the products that were shipped on that. I mean, there were, further up from New Lebanon, there was even a shirt factory where you could, shirts were loaded up in boxes and shipped down to wherever they were going to go, whether it was to Chatham, south to Chatham, and then New York, or north to Montreal. But there was a comb factory and a boot factory, and all kinds of economics that were helping these smaller towns to be successful. And then suddenly, with this line going out of business, it was kind of a death knell for the economies of all these small towns.
Yeah, the headlines are interesting. It says Rutland Railroad dies quiet death, slow local freight is funeral train.
Yeah, and speaking of funeral train, Henry Tilden, who had donated the property for this train station to be built, it was his brother Samuel Tilden that had been, our supposed to be president in 1876, but he lost to Rutherford Hayes by one vote. But when he passed away, he'd lived in New York City for a while. He took on Boss Tweed. The Teapot Dome scandal, that if anybody knows the history back then, it was a pretty rough time. But he passed away and in New York City, and he was brought up to New Lebanon on the train through that corkscrew railroad line, and allowed to be brought right up to the cemetery of the Evergreens, which the train line past that train station kept going, and was able to stop near the cemetery of the Evergreens, where they took him off and then brought him up to the cemetery, where we have him in a fairly large grave site that is well known enough to a lot of people in the area. And it's it's not below ground. It's one of these large large stones.
Yeah. All
But
part of the history.
yes,
Yeah.
and very important because trying to connect all this the local impact that New Lebanon had on not just the towns surrounding it, but pretty much eventually around the world, because of the train line and the shipping of products and to help bring products in and ship products out. It was quite a beneficial time from that 1869 when that train pulled out till when the last train pulled out in 1953. And it was, as I said, kind of bittersweet. And it's kind of a fantasy of mine. Of course, it wouldn't happen in, the rest of my lifetime, but it would be such a great idea with, climate change to get trains going again so that there are fewer cars on the road. I don't think that would happen because right now it would be billions of dollars, especially if in the 1850s and 60s it was $1 million. That's a lot of money back then, But Cornelius Vanderbilt had been convinced to provide some of his funds, even though he had big questions in his mind about the longevity of that railroad line existing. And he said to the gentleman, Trenor Park, from the Vermont Railroad, I'll do this, but I know, and I can tell you right now, his famous quote, in 3 generations, there's going to be grass growing up through these lines, and, mark my words kind of a thing, because he couldn't, the financial rewards were not panning out, that he, was not able to get back what he had promised and paid out to support. So that was it was really good while it lasted, but as it started to fade, there were fewer and fewer trains on the track. There was about 3 trains a day, and it just was not financially profitable. I mean, passengers used the train a lot. Kids would go from they'd get on the train near their homes and ride it to the school and get off at the school with a train line that went right behind our Union School in New Lebanon, right next door to the high school now that is there. It's going to be a long process, even with the capital grants that we hope to get from the state of New York. That's going to be, a couple years down the road. It takes a while. You have to be able to prove, this is what we're going to do. And engineer us to, as I said before, the engineer has to supply a report and architectural designs and whatever. So we're also in the middle of applying for smaller grants so that we can get little repairs done, even if they're temporary, just to hold off until we get the bigger grants to really go gung-ho on it and really get going on restoring it. It's also kind of, it's going to be decided over the next couple of months or so between the town of New Lebanon and the Corkscrew Rail Trail Association as to who will be primarily responsible for this building, besides the fact that the Corkscrew Rail Trail does own it, but as I said before, they're more focused on clearing the trail and getting easements for the property owners, so that the depot, which, it's a little bit overwhelming if you look at it, it could be off-putting to, we have to spend time and energy on this now. They're not really so much interested in that. They want the building. They're very appreciative of it because it will certainly help them. Right. But if the town can become kind of the overseer of it, to be in charge, then a subcommittee like the Depot Restoration Committee that I am on can proceed with doing the rest of the nitty-gritty hard work on it, whether it's even physical, because Kristen and I were in there one day back in May, sweeping out and cleaning out all of the unmentionables, little bits of plaster and all kinds of material that had to be shoveled out and cleaned. And then it looked pretty good after we were done, and put up a security fence around it because we just wanted to make sure that people would be safe if they wanted to look at it, but not to risk going inside because, the roof itself, we're not sure you're stepping inside and suddenly a piece of slate
right.
comes off the roof.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating journey.
Yes.
And I can picture it when it's complete,
Yeah.
with the painting,
Yes.
Of the interior proudly displayed on the wall.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you very much,
today.
Rick. Yes.
And we're going to follow you through your journey, and we will send over a videographer.
Good.
And as things progress,
Good.
we would love to learn more and see more. And share with our community. That would be great.
Good.
We all love trains in the Berkshires as well.
Oh, I know.
And we have so many train depots
I know. Yes.
here that we cherish.
Yeah.
So having another one to visit would be fantastic.
Yeah.
So.
It's really become an awakening, like a light bulb going on, certainly in my head, that my goodness, the railroad buffs that are around, they're hundreds. They've been coming out sort of out of the woodwork,
right.
Hearing about this. The more we've got it publicized, and we hope to keep everybody updated, certainly to let you know, as
right.
you said, to keep you in the loop, and. Hopefully in a couple of years, if we can have a grand reopening of the train station, we'll have everybody there with a ribbon cutting ceremony and band there with playing.
We will be there for sure.
Yeah, stars and stripes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this opportunity.